healthcare business podcast from the Coker Group that focuses on solutions to help healthcare organizations effectively navigate the changing healthcare industry landscape.
Welcome back to another episode of Coffee with Coker. Thanks for joining us. In today's episode, we're talking healthcare cybersecurity again. We've talked about this in the past, and it's always a popular topic. It's one of those things that it's always top of mind for organizations out there. And today we're joined again by Jeffery Daigrepont. He runs Coker's healthcare technology practice. And then also joining us and Jeffery is Dan Stewart. Dan is the president of Jackson Health Tech Advisors. They're a partner of ours that we work closely with on various cybersecurity matters for clients. And today's discussion was really just running through some, common topics and questions as it relates to cybersecurity. Some helpful information there for whether it's a hospital, a health system, a medical practice, all types of entities that would consider possible issues and challenges and needs related to cybersecurity. We talked about what are some of the threats that are out there. We talked about the cost of a breach, a data breach, or some other type of issue as it relates to cybersecurity. We also talked about some of the obstacles that come up as far as implementing a good cybersecurity program and plan and response operation. And so we dig into some of the financial aspects of that, some of the organizational priorities, and some of the personnel and training issues, things like that. So anyway, a pretty broad discussion related to this topic, but all things that are very relevant and very pertinent to a lot of the issues we see working with clients. And so we'll probably come back and address, as we often do, address some of these things in greater detail, because a number of these areas we could honestly sit and talk for an entire episode just on one or two of them. So if you have questions, or if there's something you'd like us, if there's something we covered that you'd like us to dig into deeper, please feel free to reach out to us. But we hope you enjoy this episode, which you can find along with all of our episodes on our website at coffeewithcoker.com or via the Coker website, which is just cokergroup.com. We hope you enjoy this episode with Jeffery and Dan. Thanks for listening. Welcome back to another episode, and welcome back, Jeffery.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Appreciate the introduction.
And welcome the first time to the podcast, Dan Stewart. Welcome, Dan.
Thanks, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, thanks. And today, as we mentioned in the intro, we're talking again about cybersecurity, which is always a hot topic for us, always a very hot topic in the industry as a whole. So we wanted to drill down. There are a number of things we have here that we're going to kind of run through. We won't have enough time to drill down into the nitty-gritty detail on every single one, but I think the idea is that we can have a few good discussion points and tee up some of these items, and then probably come back and do a little bit more deeper dive on some of them, if not all of them, perhaps. But I guess a good place to start, Jeffery and Dan, is let's just talk about kind of where we're at as far as the healthcare industry and the current state of cybersecurity and what's been going on now that we're in 2020.
You know, it's kind of ironic that we're doing this on the day that the government just levied charges on the Equifax breach that happened here in Atlanta. The FBI just charged 4 Chinese military officers, of all people. So, you know, you think local kid in the basement that's doing hacking. In many cases, these are organized governments,
organized crime,
organized crime, bad actors. And, you know, in healthcare, it was always something that happened to somebody else. And it wasn't until more recently that you start to see the big headlines as the industry outside of healthcare, like the Equifaxes, really start to harden their data centers. The hackers have since turned to softer targets, which is typically hospitals and physician practices. And then to make matters worse, the government is now going back and auditing practices, specifically those that took meaningful use money, and they're looking to see if they did their security risk analysis. In fact, that's the number one cause of having to refund back your meaningful use incentive money. And so that's getting a lot of attention right now. So I think people are finally starting to take it serious, which is a good thing. And but at the same time, I also think a lot of health systems are struggling. It's very overwhelming.
One of the interesting things about the Equifax scenario, and I'm not familiar with it, but we always tend to say for years, you know, how far advanced the financial industry has been on utilizing technology and data, and healthcare has kind of been sluggish or behind as far as adoption and utilization. But now that's, like you said or alluded to, Jeffrey, that's not necessarily the case. Healthcare is a very attractive target. So I guess, I don't know, Dan, maybe walk us through not only what your thoughts are on the current state, as Jeffrey walked through, but also why is healthcare so attractive to cybercrime?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with Jeffrey's comments. It's not, from a healthcare perspective, it's not good news that we're hearing. The healthcare landscape continues to the threat landscape itself continues to evolve exponentially, and the attack surface, in other words, the vulnerabilities that we're seeing because of all the changes in healthcare and digital transformation, continued move to value-based care, et cetera, just the proliferation of data that's coming into the industry, that just makes the attack surface that much larger and many more vulnerabilities for the bad actors or the cyber criminals to really expose and really go after. The other thing is that the cyber criminals themselves are getting much more sophisticated, and they're using tools and technologies, much better than they ever have before. And so you could say right now that they're staying pretty far ahead of healthcare and the protections that we're putting in place in healthcare in our ability to fend off those attacks. If you look at, everybody likes statistics. If you look at just a few statistics, every year, with the exception of maybe 1 year, since 2010, data breaches have gone up significantly. And so a data breach, which is defined as more than 500 records or more, there has been between 2018 and 2019, there was a 36% increase. So it went from 360 to 370 in 2018 to more than 500 in 2019.
So one of the things that jumped out to me with that is 500 records seems like, in my mind, a pretty high threshold. I mean, that's a lot.
Right.
And so what happens to the other 499 that doesn't even meet that threshold to be classified as a breach? There could be a lot. My point is, there could be a lot more going on the breach side than even is in some of those numbers.
Oh, absolutely. Right now they project that 90% of all of the healthcare provider organizations across the U.S. Have had a data breach in the last 2 years, and more than 50% of those have had multiple data breaches.
Wow.
And so those are not counting the ones that are 500, less than 500 records. Pretty it's compelling. Like, so it's back to that, what everybody says, right? It's not a question of if you've been breached. It's a question of when.
And how bad it's going to be.
And it's expensive. Bad. I mean, it's a $4 billion price tag that we spend fighting it or responding to it. And one of the things that I always like to clear up is there is a big difference between an incident and a breach. A lot of these organizations can have an incident but never actually have a breach. In fact, it's not uncommon that once you do your discovery, you do your forensics, that you may learn that a hacker did penetrate the network but never actually obtain protected health information. And that's where that 500 record trigger, if they are obtaining access to 500 records that contain PHI, protected health information, then you're required to take certain action, which includes self-reporting, notifying your patients, spending a considerable amount of money on remediation. Then you'll probably have to undergo a 2 to 5 year corrective action plan where you'll have to report back that you're doing certain things to prevent it from ever happening again. So it's not only is it expensive, it could be embarrassing, it could hurt credibility, it could hurt your reputation. This is the type of stuff that shows up on the news. So,
and I have to think there is such a wide range as far as the degree of severity for a breach or even an incident, right? I mean, there could be thousands of records exposed and, hey, maybe there wasn't a whole lot of damage done. There could be 200 records exposed, but they got really good information.
The really terrifying thing is when you think data breaches, you think of your databases, right? Like your electronic health records, your practice management, your accounting systems, your HR systems, those things that have, social security numbers and whatnot.
Stuff data that could be exploited to get financial gain.
Last week, the FDA put out a notice that the GE medical devices that are now online are subject to cybersecurity threats. So now they're going after clinical devices. And you might think, well, what would they have interest in that? Well, many of these devices also contain a lot of that same data, but in this case, they may be corrupting the machines, maybe causing. It could be a form of terrorism where they are deliberately causing results to be altered to cause harm to patients,
ransomware,
right? All those things. So now that they're hitting the medical devices, that can potentially cause somebody to die. I mean, it can go to that level.
Yeah. It has gone from more of a financial focus to more of a patient safety focus, especially with medical devices, and really broader than that. In terms of IoT and OT. I mean, there are ways now that these cyber criminals can shut down, for example, the air conditioning at a hospital, and they can do a lot of things that have really nothing to do with information technology per se, but they can shut down a business just like that.
Infrastructure support, things like that. Yeah,
exactly.
Jeffrey, you mentioned the $4 billion price tag there. Well, tell me about kind of the true cost involved in data breaches and I guess cybersecurity as a whole, because you ran through some of the things that the price tag keeps going up and up when you got these different assessments and then certain compliance standards that have to be met. But I mean, just dealing with for instance, the GE device scenario. I mean, that I just can't imagine. The numbers seem like endless.
Yeah. So the fines, the cost mark is all over the place. I mean, for example, there was a small company out that we worked with that had a lost laptop. Honest mistake. People do that all the time. It happens. Sure. And they actually self-reported the lost laptop. They did the right thing, but it turned out the laptop did not have encryption, and they ended up selling for $60,000. I think it started well into six figures, but that's just an example of a tiny, honest mistake, a very common mistake, one that happens all the time. I've seen it go well into the millions of dollars, especially if they have to get forensic people involved, if there's auditing involved, if there's an active, ransomware where they may have to get Bitcoins involved and they're paying off the ransomware. It can certainly get expensive. And then the follow up to that, usually there's countless amount of funding for remediation policies. And then, like I said, if you have to go under a corporate integrity agreement, you could have 2 to 5 years of auditing. So now your legal fees are going up, your consulting fees are going up, your IT fees are going up. It can certainly.
And that's not even including the investment you hopefully made on the front end to hopefully prevent or avoid.
In some cases, people do have cybersecurity insurance, but Dan and I are actually reviewing a policy now for a client. And you'd be surprised how oftentimes these policies allow for them not to pay if they discover you did not handle your cybersecurity profile correctly. For example, they too will ask, well, did you do your security risk assessment? And if you cannot demonstrate, there's a really good chance they'll deny that claim.
Right. Yeah, it's the insurance companies send the questionnaires, and they all really ask you about your current security controls. So the better your controls are, the less the insurance policy is going to cost, and the higher the limits will be, and the less deductibles and all that.
It's like how many drinks a day do you have on your health insurance?
Right. Yeah. So, and Jeffrey's absolutely right. What happens is, especially the smaller providers, they tend to answer yes on everything. And then it turns out if they do have a breach, or when they do have a breach, then the insurance company comes back, they investigate it, and they say, sorry, you didn't keep up your end of the agreement. So when we look at repercussions of a data breach, we really look at 5 different areas. And Jeffrey mentioned sort of the legal side with the OCR, the penalties, the fines, and that type of thing. And then there's also other financial impact. That's the cost of remediation. You're spending a lot of money on typically on ID theft monitoring. Which can be $25 per month per patient. So if you have a significant breach, and then that lasts over a period of time. So you have that. You have reputational damage, which everybody talks about, but they've only over the last year or two started trying to put some statistics together on what does that really mean? And so what they're finding in healthcare is that it's a significant decrease in the number of patients. So your patient loyalty is gone. The patients say, "Look, I'm nervous now. I'm going to go to
another option,
another provider."
I have to think that old adage about no such thing as bad media doesn't apply, and when it's cybersecurity, medical records are potentially even causing problems in the clinical setting.
Absolutely,
and the risk there.
And that $4 billion that it cost the industry in 2019, that doesn't include the loss of patients and just that whole area in terms of you also tend to lose employees. Then you've got operational costs that we sort of talked about before. That is what you have to do from a remediation standpoint. And then, as we mentioned, the clinical considerations with patient safety. The other thing to look at in terms of what does it cost you when you have a breach is that it's going to cost you maybe 60% of your overall cost in that first year after the breach. And then it's going to be probably another 20% over the next 2 years. So it's costing you over a 3-year period, to have a data breach.
So we've talked a bit about what goes into, the breach, the cost, the risk there, but maybe we can back up for a second and talk about, some of the obstacles that a provider group or a health system or any sort of healthcare services organization, some of the things that they have to face as far as challenges and obstacles along the way in order to get to that point where their security is adequate. I mean, obviously financial is one. There's an investment involved there. So, and it's probably a lot of that is limiting the risk of further financial costs down the road. But what are some of the other obstacles that pop up?
One of the things that rarely gets discussed that is so critical, because when you start analyzing how did the breach actually happen, when you look retrospectively into breaches, I would say 60% of the time it was an insider threat. So we spent all this time protecting, building strong, fortifying our filters, our firewalls, our passwords, our infrastructure. And when I say insider threat, that's not necessarily a corrupt employee. It's someone who could be manipulated. They have what's called social engineering, where they actually trick individuals into giving up their credentials.
Sure.
So in many cases, it's not even a hack. It's just that stolen credentials and they log on. In fact, where this became fairly well known was in the Hillary Clinton emails. It was her. There was no hack there. It was a phishing campaign that tricked her campaign manager into resetting his password. And in doing so, he gave the hackers his actual credentials. So there was no hack. They just actually logged in. You'd be surprised how many times that happens.
And how sophisticated they can get. Too.
Right. And what's really terrifying about this is that some organizations, unfortunately, have the type of culture that if a person or employee reports that they accidentally clicked on a link, they could get in trouble. So you'd be surprised how many times people actually hide the fact that they clicked on something they shouldn't have, when they should be telling their administrators that they've done that. But insider threat is a pretty big challenge, also very difficult to protect against, because you're relying on the person to make a good decision, and there's just not a lot of technology out there that can protect someone from making poor decisions.
Sure. Right. And it's interesting. You talked about insider threats. Healthcare has twice as many insider threats as the next closest industry. And as Jeffrey said, it typically starts with an email phishing campaign, and that leads to a compromise that ends up many times becoming a ransomware threat. And ransomware threats are rampant in healthcare. And a trend that's sort of a disturbing trend from my perspective is that over the last several years, the healthcare organizations that are actually paying the ransomware has gone up.
Yeah. So Dan, clarify that for the listeners, because I feel like that's one of those things that gets thrown out there and people assume that's like some NSA level, very techie thing that only happens to, some major organization somewhere. I mean, but this is happening all over the place daily. And many of them, like you said, are just getting resolved by paying the ransom.
Absolutely. And what you're seeing is, I mean, hackers are very intelligent. They're going to go after the low-hanging fruit. And typically what you see is the healthcare organizations that have the least protection, that don't really have a cybersecurity program, are the easiest ones to hack into. And they're also the ones that tend to pay. And one of the problems is that they don't do proper backup disaster recovery. They don't have isolated recovery areas for their data. And so when that data is being held hostage, then they don't have typically an alternative. So the problem, though, is if they go ahead and say, okay, we're going to pay it and you give us the key so that we can uncrypt the data and get our data back, the hacker doesn't have to give that data back. And then if you say, well, I'm not going to pay because I've got my data over here, I've got it back up, you can't touch that, so you can have that data. What the hackers will do is they'll leak the data.
Sure.
And so that causes, a major problem, for you down the road. As far as the other obstacles, and this is sort of based on this insider threats, is organizational priority, or actually lack of organizational priority. Most of your hospitals and your provider organizations are on somewhat razor thin margins. And right now, I think the average is maybe 3 to 4% of their IT budget they're spending on cybersecurity. So if you look at banking and finance, it's maybe 14 to 16%. And so, you're not putting money into it. It's not a priority from the top down within an organization. And then you really can't find qualified security officers as well. And so if leadership and the board doesn't believe that this is something that is important, then they're not going to do it. We still come across clients that go, it's not going to happen to me. It's going to happen to my competitor down the street, which we know is not true.
We're just hoping for the best. Avoid risk by just denial.
And there's some inexpensive ways that you can self-monitor. For example, we run vulnerability scans. This is very inexpensive to do it. It's non-invasive. We attach a little agent. It does a first-line pass of scanning all your devices and equipment. It comes back. It's not the only measure you should take, but it's a real good, inexpensive way to determine the health and the risk of your IT.
Well, I think where those are good is that it either validates that you don't have gaps, right, or if you do have gaps, it identifies where they probably are.
Now, yeah. I will say this, and anyone listening to this, I strongly discourage you from running a vulnerability scan if you're not going to take action. Because the minute
then you just document it.
Now you're on record that you have these problems, and that's where things can. Now, I don't recommend that you ignore it either,
right,
but I think it's important to know that if you are going to go through an assessment, odds are, in fact, we've never ran one. We could run one ourselves. The whole point of it is to identify new things that continuously creep into your network.
Where you need to address
It's every
issues.
email. It's every outdated, patch that somebody hasn't uploaded. It's one machine that's sitting on your network that no one knows about. It's just the basic housekeeping stuff that it tells you. The next level would be penetration testing. But I say if you're just unsure, just run a vulnerability scan. It'll give you a sense.
Starting point. But that goes back to your organizational priority. Yeah, I mean, I think that's
exactly
absolutely critical because, a lot of organizations out there either kind of hoping for the best or maybe even living in a little bit of a state of denial. And honestly, I know the financial burden. I mean, it's an investment. And yes, a lot of your community, rural health systems, provider groups, yes, there are challenges there as far as what the financial capacity or investment constraints are. But I don't know that that's always a valid excuse. I mean, You're talking about where are you potentially at risk here and where are the costs associated with that?
I think where a lot of the misunderstanding comes from and false comfort is that we hear this all the time is that I have a cloud vendor or my vendor manages that for me.
They tell me
or we don't even have servers on premise anymore. Everything's virtualized. And that's a little bit of a falsehood because you're still responsible for desktops, your network. In fact, as we talked about a second ago, the social engineering, the phishing campaigns, they could log into your cloud-based server just as well as they could an on-premise server. So just because you have a cloud vendor or someone's managing your IT infrastructure. In fact, it's probably even more critical that you identify that you're asking them if they're doing their security risk assessments, do they have insurance? Do they have backup? Do they have redundancy? A lot of times you're disappointed to learn that your partners are not adequately protected either.
Sure.
Right. Let me touch on a couple points. We had talked about the organizational priority or lack of organizational priority when we're talking about insider threats and how significant that is. And I think, as Jeffrey said, some are malicious, but the majority are non-malicious. That just sort of proves the point. If there's no priority for security, then you're not going to train your staff. And they're not going to understand cybersecurity. One of the other things that we do, we have clients all the time that the CIO may say to us, hey, will you come in and will you talk to our board and senior leadership and really educate them on cybersecurity and healthcare and what the environment looks like today. And we will even go in and use their organization as an example and say, if you had a ransomware threat today and it put you out of business for 5 days, this is how it would impact you in all the different categories: financial, reputational, operational, et cetera. There's, in general, industry confusion, and some of that is convenient confusion because senior leadership doesn't want to admit that there is necessarily a problem. But you've also got a confusion based on the fact that there's probably 200 vendors in the marketplace today that say they provide cybersecurity services, and the majority of those vendors are product vendors or tool vendors. We call them tool jockeys. And so what they do is they focus on their particular tool, and they'll say, my endpoint protection suite is better than everyone else's, when in fact, it's not about technology. Technology is only one component. It's about people, processes, technology, and having a framework that you really build and maintain your security program on. And so what happens, and what's happened over the years, is that all these vendors come in, they sell these point solutions. And so you have no integration, which means that your visibility in terms of being able to recognize a potential incident is cloudy at best. And you're spending all this money. And then every time there is a new threat in the marketplace, then one vendor will build a system to really address that threat. So you continue to have all of these point solutions with no integration, no visibility. It's costing you an arm and a leg, and clients are confused. Our approach is really one of security as a service. It really needs to be a service because nobody can afford, having 100 different tools and technologies in there, and then having to afford all of the resources that they're going to need to be able to manage those. For give you a quick example, if you look at a SIM system, which is security information and event management, which monitors the client's log files, basically. If you buy a product and you put it in house, then at a minimum you're going to have 12 FTEs to be able to dedicate themselves and manage that, because you've got to do it on a 24-hour, 7-day a week, 365-day scenario, or it doesn't make any difference. So we've had clients that have that, and they say, well, we've got 2 people working that. And I said, well, when do they do that? And he says, well, we do it 8:30 to 5 Monday through Friday. And then we sort of come back and say, well, I'm not sure that the hackers really adhere to that kind of schedule. Right. Yeah. So anyway, like I said, industry confusion is part of it as well.
And it's not enough just to have it. And I think that goes back to the old 3-legged stool of people, process, and technology. And just getting the technology is not going to be enough. And unfortunately, you don't find that out until a lot of times you're knee deep in a breach.
Well, the other thing that is the major advantage of having a security program or a security officer as a service, it's not so much, obviously monitoring is the key. You want to sort of be like the Maytag repairman, where you're not really having to take a lot of action because you set up the program so well, you provide the education, you got the proper infrastructure in place to at least filter out as much of the threats as you can. But it really comes down to how do you respond to the incident. You got that critical first 24 to 48 hours that can make all the difference. Again, going back to the Equifax, what's coming out today is that they had been in those systems for months, coming in and out undetected. So, in fact, if you look at the massive amount of money they're paying, it's largely due to the incident or lack thereof. They didn't really respond appropriately.
Yeah.
And so one of the emerging trends that we're seeing in the market today is people are actually standing up insurance policies that include incident responses as well too. So that way you have a team, and usually an incident response team comes with someone that knows how to speak to the media. There's an attorney involved. There's a compliance officer involved. There's IT forensic people. Remember, you're responding to the threat in real time in most cases. So you may be quarantining, computers, taking things offline.
Yeah.
You're going to need people that can move quickly. That's not the time that you start wondering, well, who do I call to help me with this? You already have the team ready to go.
I want to kind of get down to a practical level here, because I know folks listen to this, and a lot of the clients we work with, it kind of starts here. But where should they start? What are the main things they should be focusing on? And not only getting this type of program or getting this function off the ground, but then maintaining it, as this stuff seems to change like literally daily.
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. So what we recommend to our clients is it's a 5-step process. And the first step always is they have to understand their threat landscape, what their cybersecurity profile is at that particular point in time. And the way they do that is through an assessment. And that assessment is not just a one-time, and it's ongoing. And the assessment basically says, here are the specific vulnerabilities and potential threats to your organization. And then when we do the assessment, the result of that is a remediation plan that says, here are the initiatives that you need to complete in order to have an appropriate balance between your cybersecurity protection and the investment that you're making in cybersecurity. And then we provide services, and back to this security as a services approach, we provide services to remediate, to help them execute the remediation plan. We help them build a roadmap that says, okay, you've got 20 things that need to be done. Obviously, from a cost standpoint, a resource standpoint, you can't do everything at once. So let's prioritize. What's the most important thing for you to do? So then we basically say, consider using a third party, not only on the initial assessment, but can come back and conduct periodic security reviews. And what we find with our clients is that initial remediation plan, there'll be some subscription type services they're going to want on an ongoing basis. And then as their threat landscape changes, they expand the services that they look to for a third party.
I guess the point there, as far as maintaining the level of protection to evolve, is that it has to be an ongoing thing. It can't be something you come in and do, you put it on the shelf, maybe you get around to it in a few more years, because then it's just going to be starting over from scratch.
Right. And one of the things that is important is formal and continuing education. As we've discussed today, the biggest hole in healthcare is insider threats. And then the final piece is that, and Jeffrey had mentioned this, everyone needs an incident response plan. And typically the incident response plan needs to be tied into the disaster recovery and business continuity plan of the organization. And that's the one where you not only have the plan that says, okay, what do we do when we have a breach operationally and who does what, but what do we do from a marketing standpoint? What do we do with our clients? Who notifies, the federal government, all of these things. One other point that I think is important, what they call the dwell time in healthcare, and the dwell time is the time that a breach starts and then the time that you actually discover it. It's around 200 days. So somebody's in your system and they've breached your network and they've compromised records, and you don't know about it typically for 200 days. With an incident response plan and with a good cybersecurity program, if you can find that breach within the first 30 days, you're going to save yourself on the average $1 million in terms of your recovery fees.
Sure.
And again, the incident response plan, because it also focuses on the operational side of it, can be a big advantage to discovering the breach as quickly as possible.
Last year, went to one of the educational sessions that it was like a Georgia Hospital Association, I think, or something. And the speaker was the lady that was in charge of response at, I believe it was Tulane Medical Center in New Orleans after Katrina or during Katrina. And she went through like all of the process, the different steps, the different things. And the point is, it was about the proactive. You got to get the triage, the diagnostic, and then respond. And we're not talking about a massive natural disaster here, although those certainly happen, unfortunately. But we are talking about something that can turn into a disaster very quickly. And I think bottom line, not only quick response, but a rapid in an effective manner.
And I would also add that the security risk analysis is an absolute starting point. You have to do that if you're seeing Medicare patients. And remember, that is the top cause of giving back your money. And it's a pass-fail type of thing. You either did or you didn't. And there's not really much gray area with that. So if you haven't done so already, you should get one done. If you're not sure, give us a call. We'll send you a template. You can download a template. Most of the effort that goes into that is just gathering all the information and then making sure that you actually implement and follow through with it. So again, just like I said earlier, if you're going to start down that process, make sure you follow through with it.
Yeah.
And that's a good point. When we do a security risk assessment, it includes the compliance portion that Jeffrey is alluding to, the HIPAA high-tech requirement. You still have a requirement. Now it's promoting interoperability, but you still have a requirement, and you have to do the remediation and demonstrate that you're making progress on your remediation every year. So it's not really an option, for most providers.
Yeah, we haven't even touched on the compliance elements to dealing with cybersecurity breach here. I mean, that's a whole other world of documentation and responses that are required in order to ensure.
Yeah, I'll give you one example that trips up people. That everyone will answer this question correctly: is do you provide training for your employees? Well, of course we do. I mean, we do that here at Coker. In fact, we're going through it now internally, and then we'll do it again in our annual meeting. But then the next question is, what was the results of the training? I mean, how did they pass? Did they fail? What did you do with the ones that fell? So you have to also demonstrate that, not only did we train, here's the results of the training. And then you can show how you corrected the risk areas or what did you do to teach? Like, for example, a phishing campaign, you can run and should run one on yourself. Well, 20% of our employees clicked on links that they should have. And we know that because we're running our own phishing campaigns. Yeah. So and then you provide the education that goes with it. Employee, you realize you clicked on the link that you should have clicked on. The one that we had here at Coker not too long ago was they spoof emails too.
Right.
So the email
Pretty
came
sophisticated
from, so it looked like it came from our internal employee. It was directed at HR to change the direct deposit. And they were on the verge of changing it until we implemented a policy that said you don't change direct deposits till you actually get a verbal confirmation. So you can get an email, but I could email or somebody could spoof my email and send it to HR and say, hey, change this direct deposit. So it's something as simple as that. And that's where there's no technology that blocks that. I mean, you can filter it. You can do a pretty good job identifying, did that email originate from Russia? If so, it doesn't get through the firewall. But sometimes they can launch those attacks from on-premise US-based servers, sometimes from Internet of Things. They're operating out of the refrigerators now that have operating systems, and those are hard to detect. But at the end of the day, it comes down to making sure those employees just don't click on unsafe links.
That's right, and that's for sure the hardest thing and no software solution is going to be able to do that perfectly.
Well, and then even beyond the emails and the stuff we were talking about this awareness, they will actually physically come onto your property. They'll walk in and leave jump drives, or they'll pretend to be a patient. They'll make their way in the back. Sometimes they'll put on suits. They'll knock off badges. They look very official. They may be walking around looking for information that they could just pick up that can go undetected, that somebody's just stealing records. They'll dive in dumpsters. There's no limits to what they'll do or won't do to obtain this information. It's very rich data too. When you think about what the dark web really is after, it's social security numbers, address, next of kin, alias. It has all the ingredients of everything you need to apply for a loan or get credit card information, all that information.
Yeah. Yeah. Just to add to that, one of the ongoing services that a lot of clients need to consider is a virtual CISO type program or an interim CISO. But anyway, once the assessment is done and the remediation is complete, or the remediation is laid out, the plan itself, then having someone come on site, once a month and have meetings. And one of the keys is for that person to be looking at what's the progress that you are making in terms of your remediation plan.
Well, I think one of the key takeaways is, again, we've kind of bounced around talking about a number of things, but the assessing your level of security today and having a plan, commitment, willingness to invest, and doing whatever needs to be done on that over time on an ongoing basis. And the other thing is just that, in my opinion, going back to the spend on or the budget allocation to security is, in my opinion, this is not an optional thing anymore. I mean, I think maybe 10 years ago, it was a little bit more Wild West, and it was one of those things you could kind of, again, go on for a little bit in denial. Now, there is no kind of, there are no good excuses for not doing it anymore, because the repercussions are significant, and they're real, and they're not only happening to certain organizations. They are targeting all kinds of these organizations, at least within healthcare. So,
well, if you don't get hit with an attack, you could get hit with an audit. And either way, you have to demonstrate.
That's right. That's right. I mean, there's no way to avoid this stuff, and it doesn't have to just be a necessary evil either. I mean, I think there are a lot of opportunities here for innovation and providing a higher level of service. I mean, at the end of the day, that's what these organizations really are and need to be focused on. So this is a part of that.
Maybe as a wrap up, we can I sometimes worry that we're depressing people when we do these, because it does sound very daunting and overwhelming. A bit of good news is that there are lots of really good, inexpensive technology now that can help you and your organization protect yourself. Things that can monitor, proactively go out and seek and destroy threats, that can filter out the bad stuff before it gets to your employees. I mean, if you just look at our Barracuda log that we get periodically, I mean, I probably get as many emails received as I get blocked, because we're proactively identifying where those threats, so they never make it to our end users, and that's what you want to see. Now,
which goes back to making yourself not low-hanging fruit,
right.
Or limiting the low-hanging fruit that you.
And hackers in general are considered lazy people. I mean,
Sure.
I'm told that the average will spend 2 to 4 hours attempting before they move on to a weaker target. So they don't really spend a lot of effort. They want quick in and outs, and so
and they're looking for a lot of heavy vulnerabilities,
right?
As I think I mentioned before, every organization can afford a good cybersecurity program. And talking about the hackers are typically lazy, you need to, when you do an assessment, you need to identify and prioritize your assets. And so the 20% of the assets that are critical to your organization, those are the ones that you need to protect. You need to focus on. So you don't have to focus on everything. You're focusing on the 80% or whatever that is most vulnerable, because the hackers are going to go in and if it's difficult for them, then they're going to go on to someone else. So everyone can afford a program if they just look at the basic blocking and tackling. On the technology side, just a patching program, operating systems, making sure those are updated, policies and procedures. We see a lot of clients that have the policies and procedures, but they don't necessarily adhere to those.
Yeah.
So a lot can be done for minimal cost. And again, as we talked about, the whole point is to be able to understanding that there are budget restrictions, but also understanding that you don't have a choice in terms of having a cybersecurity program. It's just what's the best balance? What's the investment that you need to make to provide an adequate level of ongoing security for your organization and for your patients?
Well, I think that rounds it out well. I mean, again, we covered a lot, bounced around a little bit, but definitely a number of things that I know we'll revisit and jump into in more detail. And of course, we have a lot of other material on this topic and related topics that we'll make available and that will continue to come out here in the future. So thanks, Dan and Jeffrey.
Yeah,
and
thanks,
look
Mark.
forward to
Enjoyed it.
talking more in the future. All right. Thanks, guys.
We hope you enjoyed that episode of Coffee with Coker, and we thank you for listening. We want to encourage all of our listeners to participate and contribute in the podcast. So if you have any questions on any of the things we discussed in this episode, any of the topics that were presented, please feel free to ask us. Also, we welcome your feedback and suggestions. If you have any ideas related to the material we discussed in this episode, or in any episode, please let us know and we'll make sure to incorporate it. And if you have ideas for topics you'd like to hear more information about in future episodes, please send those suggestions to us. We would love to hear them and we'd love to incorporate them into our future episodes. You can find us online and on social media. Start with our website, and specifically the podcast is coffeewithcoker.com. You can also find that through the main Coker website at cokergroup.com. You can also find us on social media, Twitter at Coker Group, and then on LinkedIn, you can search for Coker Group and find our page and the page for some of our team members as well there. So you can find us and reach out to us in a number of places. And then if you want to contact us directly, one of the best ways to do that, email feedback@cokergroup.com. That's feedback@cokergroup.com. And again, we'd love to get your feedback, and we'd love to encourage everyone to subscribe to the podcast so that you can be notified when future episodes are released. We look forward to the next episode, and we look forward to getting your suggestions and feedback on this episode. Thanks for listening, and we look forward to speaking with you again on future episodes.